Hope you've got an iron stomach. The mayor didn't die too pretty in there. Agent Benjamin Warden paused on the dew-laden lawn and looked over at the uniformed officer that had spoken. He didn't recognize the man, and he didn't think he ever would. Generically white and square, he would fade easily into the background with all the other beat cops he'd had to meet over the years. The agent pulled a drag from the cigarette in his mouth as he stared at the cop, the silence quickly growing awkward. The younger man squinted and dropped his eyes away from him. Was just trying to be friendly. Didn't mean to offend. Ben Warden chuffed out a plume of ashen smoke through his nose. I'll be alright, kid. No offense taken. Keep up the good work. He hadn't meant a word of it, but it's what you said to subordinates. Gotta rally the troops. Or something. Motion in his peripheral pulled his eye over to the right, where he saw two more unis wrapping up interviews with a couple of brutalized men. One of them was bald, and neither was particularly pretty. Both of them sported blossoming and bleeding mounds of mottled flesh where their faces were supposed to be. Ouch, he said to himself and turned his own face away. The rising sun spilled pastels across the sky, framing the modest house in a way that would have been pleasant if he were walking up to the door under any other circumstances. There was a body in front of the door, on the small cement patch that passed as a front porch. The forensics guys were still poking over it, probing, prodding, and taking their morbid pictures. The dead man lay on his side, his back facing Warden and a pool of blood drying slowly around his head. There was a slight gash on the back of his skull, but the true damage came into view as Warden closed his approach. This man's face made the other men's look like minor injuries. It was more a concave mass of blood and swollen flesh than anything at this point. Christ, he spat as he stepped past and through the open door. The interior of the house was shiny. A lot of gilding and polished marble. A certain kind of person's idea of luxury. The entryway wasn't particularly interesting after the corpse, so Warden stalked through without much of a look. It funneled to the right and opened up into the conjoined den and kitchen area. His eyes were immediately drawn to the trail of crimson that was dripped across the floorboards. It started in a small scarlet puddle on the far side, where the den let out into the small passage that housed the doors to the various bedrooms. The blood ran from there in a line that started steady, but quickly eased up into the dotted pattern of a moving drip. He huffed a breath through his mustache. Was someone wounded? Another witness? The girl who'd made the call hadn't been wounded. Not her. Could be the culprits, depending. Warden turned left. The other side of the den area held a single door, which hung ajar and leaked out a soft light that might have been inviting on another day. Agent Warden approached the door and pushed it open gently, unveiling the large room the mayor had used as his study. A heavy wooden desk sat prominently in the center of the room, backed by bookshelves covered in a visible layer of dust. More important was the body in the corner. Across the room lay a large lump of flesh. A fat man apparently sat on the floor, wearing pants but no shirt or shoes. There was a large splatter of blood on the wall behind him, and his head was slumped forward with his chin resting on his turgid chest, which was itself sporting a gory splatter of blood that ran in a line down over his hairless, distended belly. One of his feet was attached to his leg at a very incorrect angle. Broken ankle. Hadn't had time to bruise before bodily function ceased, it seemed. Warden stepped close to the body and crouched, resting on his haunches. The position gave him a better vantage on the corpse's lowered face. This was absolutely Mayor Tromler. He'd spoken to the man just a couple of weeks back after a death threat threw up enough flags to concern the state. It was too early to know, but Warden was pretty sure that threat had nothing to do with whatever had happened here that night. The man had made as many enemies as he had supporters, and that was being generous. A black, empty hole was bored almost dead center into his prominent forehead, the spout from which so much blood had poured onto his chest. One, or more likely a few, of those enemies had found his house and made good on their anger. This was going to cause a shitstorm in the local sphere. Tromler had a lot of connections to a lot of important people. There were going to be ripples. The intensity depended entirely on the narrative his investigation could unearth around this tragedy. Who did this, and how could it be spun to the public? He sighed and dragged his face down with a sliding hand before rising back to his feet. The forensics guys would get more off the body than he would, not to mention the coroner. He spun slowly on his heel, combing his gaze over the rest of the room. When they arrived at the desk, they were immediately drawn to the single thing taking up space on the lacquered surface. A legal pad sat square in the center of the desk, the pages covered with scrawled, frantic handwriting. Warden stepped around the desk to examine the paper. At the top of the page, in the header, it read, "What happened?" in blocky, heavy letters. Warden scanned the first few lines, skimming over the words to confirm it was what he thought. The mayor's killer had left an explanation? His curiosity overtook him, and he started to read. It was the will that led me to the mayor tonight. I didn't leave the house intending to kill him. I never do. I followed the will tonight as I have so often recently. I keep hoping it's leading me to answers, to some kind of clarity. Instead, tonight it pulled me insistently through the brittle air and over the frigid roads for nearly an hour before I found myself behind a sedan so unassuming I nearly failed to notice it right in front of my eyes. It was painted a shade of beige that repelled the human eye, and the empty night was tinted across its windows. I followed behind it on my bike for God knows how long. I wondered through every moment why the will was so interested in it. Every time I let the car drift from me, the pole would swell and it nearly felt like it was screaming at me. Whoever was driving the car and whatever they were doing, the will wanted me to see. The roads were empty aside from the sedan and my bike. It made following them incredibly easy, but doing so unseen, almost impossible. They sped down the highway, and I let them drift far enough away that I'd be little more than a glare in their mirrors. I waited a moment and then flicked off my headlight before ramping my throttle back up. I tracked the ruby embers of their taillights for another 20 minutes until the cracked facade of a lone truck stop broke through the horizon and infected the night with its fluorescence. The sedan pulled into a barren lot, and I brought myself to a stop 100 yards or so away, on the shoulder of the road where the artificial light failed to reach. I pulled a pair of small binoculars from my pocket and watched the bland car. Both front doors swung open and spewed forth an occupant. A pair of suited men spilled onto the asphalt, neither of them pleasant to look at. I was nearly blinded by the glare from the bald one's head, and the chemical fumes came off the other guy's product-laden grease mop in genuinely visible waves. The pair scuttled over the concrete towards the brick-built convenience store, angling towards the side of the building rather than the entrance. A short man hobbled out from inside the store. I could just make out the weak ringing of the bell as artificial yellow light spilled out onto the lot. He waddled off to the side and a moment later stepped into the shadows to meet with the two suited men. He made a strange contrast to them in his gray sweatpants and yellow t-shirt, both mottled with a sickening rainbow of stains. I watched in awkward silence for a moment as they spoke to each other. The crickets chirping was the only sound that reached me. Then, Grease Mop reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a crumpled manila envelope, overstuffed with whatever it contained. He passed it over to the shabby man, who snatched it with both hands, hugging it tight to the top of his paunch. He flicked it open and dipped his fingers into it, presumably infecting its contents with whatever grime undoubtedly coated his hands. He looked up a moment later and nodded, apparently satisfied, then dug a hand into his own pocket. It returned with 2 keys on a simple ring, which he handed over to Grease Mop. He took them with a sneer and followed the other man's hand as he pointed to something across the lot. Then, the thin, greasy fellow elbowed his peer, and the three parted ways. The slob rolled his way back into the convenience store, grinning so wide he was practically drooling into the envelope he still clutched. Cue Ball flashed with every step back to their beige sedan, dropping his prodigious mass into the driver's seat. His companion, however, walked in a completely different direction. He trod over the lot up to a panel van that had been white at one point in its past, but now was mottled with black decay and flaking rust. I couldn't see him as he went behind the van, but I saw it rumble on its suspension as he presumably flung himself in. The sedan grumbled quietly to life, followed by a cacophonous, rattling cough from the van that hurt my ears even from my distant vantage. Something somewhere was loose and rattling painfully under that hood. The sedan pulled out first, turning out onto the frontage road, followed soon after by the wheezing van. I would like to say I struggled to decide my next move. Heading inside to question the slob would have made sense. Obviously, he was a fence and could be a direct lead to a supply chain that needed disrupting. But there was never any question of where I'd go. The wheel pulled at me as the van's taillights began to shrink, and I followed. I kept my distance and my headlight off as I tailed them, twisting through the strange route they took. My eyes stayed locked on the black expanse within the van's rear windows, thoughts racing through my head of what might be behind them. Every now and again, I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving through the dark glass, but nothing legible ever resolved through the flashing glare of passing streetlights. The van eventually pulled onto a narrow residential street. Single-story homes lined both sides and parked cars turned the road into a nearly impassable straight. I followed behind, my bike having a far easier time navigating than the stuttering van in front of me. I saw the taillights flare as both cars slowed. The sedan parked itself on the street outside a wide blue house. The van swung around towards the opposite side of the street, shook and wheezed over an ungodly rattle, then lurched into reverse and backed itself into the driveway. I stopped my bike 100 yards away in the deep shadows between the weak radii of two ailing streetlights. The wheel was a thready pole, restless but resigned to the need for surveillance. A minute later, I learned exactly why the will had fixated on these men. Greasemop met Cueball, and they trundled together toward the back of the van. Cueball pulled the rear doors open with a piercing metallic screech. Greasemop threw himself up and into the back. The van rattled around for a moment before he re-emerged, with a young girl dragged on unsteady feet behind him. She was no older than 16, and walked with her shoulders slumped and chin sunk towards her chest. She was turned away from me almost immediately, but even the half glimpse I saw of her face was enough to tell me she was heavily drugged. She wore a yellow sundress that left her arms bare and brazenly displayed the bruises that marked her pale skin. The will began to pull more insistently as she was dragged harshly towards the house's front door. At this point, I swung my leg over the bike and stalked forward quietly, making sure to keep out of the sickly light. I pulled out my binoculars again and eyed the front door as Greasemop rapped on it with his knuckles. It swung open almost instantly, like they'd been waiting right on the other side. There was a surly, square-jawed man behind the door, wearing a similar black suit to the others. He sized the girl up with a darting glance, then stepped back and ushered the group inside. Greasemop hurried forward, dragging the girl along. He held a hand up to Cueball, waving him off with an order I couldn't hear. Presumably it was to wait with the cars because that's what Cueball went to do. His face was never pretty, but the violent frown it boasted as he simmered in the van's front seat was particularly difficult to look at. The house had a broad bay window that flickered to life with a warm light between one blink and the next. I crept a few steps closer, keeping my body up against one of the neighbors' parked cars and leering in through the window. Greasemop was there with the girl in hand. She stood next to him with her listless gaze on the floor. Her captor was talking to someone I couldn't see, but it didn't take long for them to step into view. I saw their belly first, protruding from beneath a straining white button-up shirt. They boasted a silhouette not only prodigious, but topped with a garishly thin cloud of piss-yellow hair. And it was one I recognized. Most people don't pay much attention to local politics. Hell, we're lucky if they pay attention to the national stuff. But I'm not most people. I'd know Mayor Tromler's repugnant face anywhere. Like I said, I didn't go out tonight with the intention of killing this man. I didn't even know where he lived before. That doesn't mean he hadn't already done plenty to earn some retribution. Tonight was different. Tonight, I watched him appraise the girl with a lurid, leering gaze that lingered for far too long. All he was missing was the puddling drool, and he'd be the perfect cartoon of lust. I felt my stomach lurch as he loomed over the girl and laid his hands on her, tilting her face around by the chin. His chin wobbled as he said something inaudible, and Greasemop at last let go of the girl's arm. He stepped back and out of view, leaving the girl in the mayor's hands. The front door swung open again a moment later, and Greasemop stepped back out, dragging the door shut behind him and sinking back into the darkness. He stalked over towards the cars, leaning up against the van's driver's side door to talk to Cueball. Inside the house, the mayor pulled the girl across the room, back towards wherever he'd originally come from. She followed without resistance or objection, but she was trembling even through the drug-fueled haze that kept her eyelids at half-mast. I'd seen enough at this point. I'd be lying if I told you I wasn't getting angrier by the moment. The wheel didn't need to pull to send me forth this time. It did anyway. It snapped taut in my chest like a retracting tow line. but I was already leaning into a sprint and my feet flew over the asphalt on wings of divine purpose. The shadows rushed past. Grease Mop only had half an instant to look over at me after he heard my footsteps. His jaw cracked underneath my fist as I slammed his head into the van with a left hook. His eyes crossed and blood splattered onto the vehicle's cancerous paint. He slid halfway to the ground before his legs were able to hold him up again. He was leaning against the van, his body at a sagging diagonal. His hands pressed against the van, searching for leverage. He lost it when my knee slammed up into his chin. His head thunked into the van and he went entirely limp, asleep on the ground with his neck craned at 90 degrees and his head rested against the tire. I looked up to meet Q-Ball's eyes. They were wide and darted around through the lowered window. He couldn't see what had become of his partner. He didn't need to. He tried to open the door, but found it blocked by my body. I punched his nose through the window, felt it break under my knuckles. He cried out and threw himself back, leaning over the center console. I sidestepped and threw the door open, then reached in and grabbed the man by the tie knot at his throat. He was too preoccupied with the blood sheeting over his lips to do anything about me yanking him back out of the car. He tumbled and folded to his knees next to Grease Mop's snoring form. 3 strikes to the crown of his skull dropped him unconscious. His head landed in his partner's lap. A bloodstain blossomed and grew on the leg of his slacks. There was half an instant where I debated taking the time to drag the men into the van. The will rejected the idea. I left them where they were, counting on Providence to keep passers-by away. I stepped over them and crept up to the garage door and into the deep shadows that skirted it. I moved as quickly as I could towards the front door, crouching beneath the bay window as I passed. I paused next to the door. There was a near guarantee that there'd be a guard on the other side, but their exact position was both critical and unknowable. I steadied myself with a deliberate breath. The will would carry me through. I gripped the brass doorknob with a steady hand, held it through an inhale, and then twisted and shoved. The door, miraculously unlocked, swung inward, and I pulled my hand back and out of the frame. I exhaled slowly and waited through my next 10 heartbeats. The tip of a gun barrel peeked around the corner, followed closely by the hairy hand that gripped it. I snapped out my fist and cracked him squarely in the wrist. I was surprised when it didn't break. He dropped the gun, trying to retract the injured hand. My other hand was already wrapping around the wrist, and in a moment I had him tumbling out onto the front porch. I swung him out in front of me, out of view of anyone inside. He fell onto his shoulder and rolled, his wrist breaking from my grip. I was already on my feet by the time his back slammed into the decorative pillar a few feet away. The reinforced toe of my boot crunched into the tip of his nose. The cartilage shattered and compressed beneath my foot, and his head reeled back to slam into the plaster column. When it lulled back around, his eyes were closed and the mangled remains of his nose poured blood onto the concrete. I turned and moved back towards the door, my hand on my own weapon for the first time. I drew it slowly, my other hand dipping into a pocket to extract my suppressor. I screwed it into the barrel, then flicked the safety off with my thumb and brought it up into a high, ready position next to my face. A few years ago, I would have methodically cleared my angles before going into that house. I didn't know how many more people were inside. I didn't know where they were, but I wasn't operating on my own anymore, and there wasn't time. I lowered myself into a half crouch and swung around the doorframe into the house. The will didn't pull me away from any immediate danger, and half an instant later I confirmed with my own eyes. The entryway was empty. I crept forward, swinging around the blind barrier of the door, clearing it of any waiting aggressors. The house's interior was far more ostentatious than its exterior. There were art prints framed in gaudy faux gold lining the walls. An imitation marble console sat across from the door. A weak attempt at an interior design chest puff for any unfortunate visitors. I turned down the hallway to the right. The false hardwood floors covered with the printed recreation of a Turkish rug. Even through my boots, I hated the way it felt underfoot. The light was dim, cast only from a lamp near the door. It made a growing shadow ahead of me as I crept forward. The hall opened up into the den area that I'd seen the mayor in through the bay window. A baroquely furnished space that came together to create the general impression of gilded vomit. I took a moment to clear it and the adjoining kitchen, both of which proved themselves unoccupied. Then I set my gaze on the small hallway on the far side, where the bedrooms presumably lay in wait. I stalked into the narrow space slowly, careful to keep my footsteps light and inaudible. There were 3 doors that I could see. 2 to my left and 1 to the right. I could hear rustling and the occasional muffled word coming from the right door and stepped up to it. I'm ashamed to admit, I considered turning around and walking out. The will was pulling hard, demanding I burst through the door. I know what I've been called to do, and I know I have the tools to do it. But to be honest, I'm tired. Violence, even done in retribution for the true evils of this world, weighs on a soul. They drag us down into their filth and corruption because you can't stop a shark attack from the shore. A voice. Some might call it the devil, but I know it's just a part of me, was telling me that this didn't need to be my responsibility, that there were systems in place to seek justice for these crimes. The girl's face was the first image to remind me, along with the countless faces of people failed that followed hers. That system is broken, has been since the beginning, on earth as it is in heaven. If heaven doesn't permit these depraved monsters within its bounds, why should the earth? I sighed quietly into my mask. Exhaustion's weight is ever present, but remembering my calling always lightens the burden. I tested the door. It was locked. It was also a paltry slab of plywood framed by subpar lumber. I took a step back, then lifted a foot and kicked through the spot just next to the knob. The door swung open in a shower of splinters and screams of shock. On the other side of the door was an unsightly pale blob of a man, sitting shirtless on the bed. I thanked God that his pants at least remained on. He threw his hands up into the air in supplication the moment he saw my handgun pointed at his chest. The girl was standing off to my left, clearly in the middle of stripping for the creature. Her eyes were wide and glassy, drifting back and forth between my gun and my face, but never meeting my eyes. I did my best to keep my voice calm and told her to put her clothes back on. She stared at me blankly, still trembling and otherwise unmoving. Mayor Tromler's gravel voice roughed up the air. I don't know what you think is happening. Shut your fat fucking mouth, I growled. I hope you'll forgive my language. I kept my weapon trained on the man, but turned back to look at the girl. Please, I'm here to help you, but I need you to put your clothes back on so we can get you out of this house. Enough of my words apparently pierced the haze of drugs because she started moving and went to pick up her dress from where it lay on the ground. I went back to the mayor as she worked to get it back on. Give me your phone, I ordered. He tried to object. The attempt didn't survive a minor thrust of my firearm. He dug his pudgy hand into the interior pocket of his jacket, discarded on the bed next to him. It returned gripped around his smartphone. I told him to toss it to me, and he did. The screen activated as I caught it, locked behind a keypad. Passcode. Now, I growled at him. He stammered out the code, and I punched it in. The phone unlocked, and I took the next 30 seconds to turn off the screen lock. Then, I opened the camera, lifted the device, and snapped a picture of the mayor in his compromised position. He tried to throw his hands up to cover his face, but as expected, he was far too slow. I looked back over at the girl and held the phone out to her. She had her dress back on, slightly off-kilter, but covering all the important bits. Take this phone, I told her gently, and get out of here. Get yourself somewhere safe, wait 20 minutes, and call the cops. She raised a hand slowly, taking the phone in fingers I wasn't convinced had the strength to hold it. They did all the same. She took the phone and held it close to her chest. I stepped to the side, giving her enough space to move past me while keeping my gun trained on Tromler. As the girl slid past, I saw a glint across the path of a singular tear that now hung haphazardly on her jawline. About 30 seconds after she left the room, I heard the front door slam as it closed behind her. Certainty's weight settled the final micron in my chest at that sound, and I raised my eyes back to meet the mayor's. They were wet with fear. Tromler's lips were trembling, and the fearful storm in his eyes had begun to pour down his cheeks. I must confess, I reveled a bit in the sight, savored it for a moment. I could feel the retributive words welling up, nearly ready to spew out onto the cretin before me. Then the look in his eyes shifted, and his gaze went over my shoulder. "Cletus!" the mayor shrieked, as an injured child does for their mommy. "Kill him! Kill him now!" At that instant, the will pulled urgently at my chest, and I followed it into a twist. A wiry fist flew into my peripheral, through the space my head had occupied a moment before. I ducked back 2 steps into the room, eyeing my attacker, a lean man with an expanse of clean-shaven scalp atop his head. He was pale, red suspenders holding up faded green cargo pants that were tucked sloppily into a pair of black boots straight-laced in red. Each of his shoulders boasted a starkly prominent swastika tattoo. His fists came flying out from his boxer stance. The strikes were rapid and precise. 1 at my chin, 3 towards my ribcage, then an elbow up at my face. The man was well trained. The flurry would have put me down if I wasn't there under a higher purpose. The holy will kept me from harm. It preempted his every move with an insistent pull and instinct's breadth before they came. His eyes narrowed and his lips pursed. He was getting frustrated. Good. Who the hell are you? Barney the Purple Punisher? His voice was reedy, higher than I'd expected. His chin got an uncomfortable answer from my fist. Next came the butt of my 1911 into his temple, throwing his head into the doorframe. Something soft pressed into my hip, slipping and grasping like a thing from the depths. I took the attacker's moment of stun lock to look down. Trommler's alabaster sausage fingers were writhing around in some weak attempt to hinder me in the fight. I swung my elbow back into his nose. It cracked and he screeched as he fell back onto the bed. The will pulled me beneath a left hook from the tattooed man, who was grinning through a face soaked halfway in his own blood. The whites of his eyes were wide and manic, his blood-soaked grin the picture of a crazed jester. Oh, I'm gonna enjoy killing you, Purple Nurple. Might take your head back to the boys, mounted in the club. The will quirked inside my ribcage at the word. In an after-school club, are ya? I'm sure your mother is very proud. His smile faltered and his eyelids creased at the corners. I'd warn you not to disrespect the sons if you like living. But you'll be dead soon, either way. He dug into the pockets of his cargo pants and pulled out a pair of brass knuckles. I'm gonna cave in your skull, boy. I didn't give the man a chance to make good on his threats. I shoved forward and got myself inside his reach. My shoulder slammed into his sternum. His back hit the wall and broke open a hole in the plaster. I slammed both fists into his stomach, one after the other in a blur. I heard a choking sound and looked up to see gory vomit seeping from between his lips. They were still spread in a wide smile, his teeth dyed cherry by his own blood. I felt the will's pull. I moved to follow it, too slowly. Too wrapped up in my own wrath. Something blunt cracked into the side of my skull. The elbow to my face threw me backwards, and I stumbled back to make a matching crater in the opposite wall. The world blurred slightly, and something warm ran down the side of my face. I braced my hands against the drywall to either side of my hole, tried to push myself up and out. Pain spiked across the other side of my head, cold and hard. I could swear I'd heard something crack somewhere in my skull. He'd started swinging with the brass knuckles. He did it twice more before I got my hands up. My fingers curled loosely into fists. He just changed to targeting my ribs, slamming the sharply machined metal into me repeatedly. My insides screamed as they were tenderized and smashed apart. He was relentless, the cherry grin only widening as he indulged the bloodlust. My vision went red, fading quickly into black. There was a sudden crush of chaotic motion, my pinprick vision filled with a pale pinkness for the span of 2 blinks. I heard the stranger's reedy voice cry out, followed by a panicked moan from the mare's. The stranger's assault had stopped and I took a breath. Rather, many small, very painful breaths, to refocus. My vision began to clear slowly as my body was freed from the onslaught. Looking down, I saw a mass of milky, pale flesh rolls attempting to consume the more rigid form of my attacker. The mare had tried to run past the 2 of us, but had pulled Cletus off of me when his girth proved too wide for the narrow passageway. They'd landed on the ground together and were currently struggling to untangle themselves. Trommler seemed to be more of a hindrance to the effort than anything. I forced myself up, grinding my teeth against the searing pain in my ribs and skull. Opportunities must be seized. I stalked over to the wrestling masses, and as I neared, one of the stranger's hands slapped down onto the linoleum in search of elusive leverage. I lifted my foot and brought it down on that hand. I could feel the metacarpals and phalanges snap and shatter even through the rubber heel of my boot. His scream was thankfully muffled by the mare's chest sagging over his mouth. I ran my fingers through the pathetically thin mop the mare passed off as his hair and gripped tight. I pulled, and was at least a little surprised when his scalp actually followed and pulled the man along. I threw the whimpering mass into the wall nearby. He nearly tore it down when he hit, and a moment later was sitting partially in the space between the wall studs. My boot shattered his ankle next, earning me a more audible screech from the coward. I chose to trust the walls were thick and the neighbors heavy sleepers. Don't move. I'm not done with you. I told him before turning back to the bonehead. He was busy nursing his hand, his fingers going in all the wrong directions. He looked up angrily and started to rise as he saw me approaching. I ended that with a swift kick to the face. He flew back in a scarlet spray and lay still, his breathing steady and wet with his own blood. I'd have spat on him if the mask weren't in my way. My eyes fell back to the fascist symbols he had embedded in his skin. It disgusted me, enraged me. But this anger was different. A rage somehow younger and more ancient than the rest. I lowered my weapon and fired a single shot, directly into the stranger's throat. The hollow above his collarbone blossomed a red deep enough to be black. His gurgles grew more violent for about 2 minutes, and then the body stilled. I turned back to the mayor. He was terrified. Tears pouring from his wide eyes. He'd shifted his weight to favor the ankle I'd broken. Good, I told him. We're finally alone. A few minutes later, the mayor sat in the corner of his own study, weeping openly. I had dragged him there, no small effort, let me assure you, and tossed him aside as I went to rifle through his desk. It was probably the most genuinely nice piece of furniture in the house, a classically solid oak desk that would read as stately if the surrounding room wasn't so overbearing. The man certainly liked the sight of gold, though he apparently didn't need the real thing. I found what I was looking for, set it on the desk, and sat down in his pleather chair. For the next few minutes, I hastily scrawled out the majority of what you've just read. When my hand started to cramp, I took a small break and looked back up to meet the man's trembling eyes. The silence hung weightily between us, more so for him than me. His nerves didn't last long under my gaze. What do you want? Money? I can give you money. His voice had risen so high it neared whistle tones. I must confess again, I indulged myself a bit here. I couldn't help the smirk at his question, though he couldn't see it. How much are we talking? His eyes lit up and he winced as he instinctively leaned forward and put extra weight on his broken ankle. Whatever you want. I have connections. I'm important. You want 100K? I can make that happen. I made a show of shrugging at the offer, since he couldn't see my face. The lines on his deepened and a new wave of flop sweat broke out on his head. More? He asked me. 200K. 500. Both offers received a shrug. His weeping broke out with a renewed strength. I'll give you $1 million, man, please! He'd have been crawling to beg if he'd been able. Mark 8:36, I cited. What? The reply fell dumbly, instinctively from his lips. It's a verse, Mr. Tromler. From the Bible. Are you familiar with it? I stared at him, making it clear I expected an answer. He shook his head. I laughed. I didn't think so. The verse is my answer to your generous offer. He knew where it was going. It was plain as day on his face. But still, he was human. He had to ask. What does it say? I leaned over on the desk and spoke the verse. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? I watched the tears begin to well in his eyes again, and for a moment I couldn't help but see the terrified child in him. A piece of my heart wanted to break for him, for that human fear. That was when the will reasserted itself in my chest and I remembered my purpose. Remembered he'd abandoned his humanity of his own volition. Your existence is devoid of anything I value, Mr. Tromler. The only things you have that I want are your life and a few answers. Not in that order, of course. Some sickly spark lit behind his eyes. You want information? I know so many secrets. I can help. I'll tell you everything you want to know if you let me go. A wry chuckle rumbled out from me and over the desk. You're not in a position to negotiate, Mr. Tromler. You're going to answer my questions, I promise you. He whimpered, but tried to puff out his chest and make a show of resistance. If you're going to kill me anyway, then why would I tell you anything? I stood from his chair at this point, stalked slowly around the desk and across the floor. His composure had already begun to break by the time I stilled and loomed over him. Every time you don't answer a question, I will break another one of your bones. Understood? His moment of hesitation was negligible. He nodded and looked down at the ground in supplication. First question, who was that man, Cletus, and why was he in your home tonight? The mayor let out a shuddering breath to slow his sobs enough to allow for speech. He belonged to one of the organizations that funded my campaign. He was here to protect me as part of my deal with them. What organization? They're called the Sons of the Father. I've heard of them. Local biker club. Since when did they have enough clout to buy a mayor? I asked. They didn't buy me. He actually sounded offended at the idea. We made a deal. They helped with campaign funds, and I helped move some things forward that benefited their organization. Yes, Mr. Tromler. That's how it works when a politician gets bought. What exactly did they want you to push forward? Some kind of deregulation on the local truckers. I didn't read the damn thing. I just signed it. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Tromler. Now, one more question for you. What do you call a man who knowingly deals with Nazis? He stared at me blankly, jaw agape, but answer not forthcoming. You call them a Nazi, Mr. Tromler. Do you know what we do with Nazis here in these United States? There was another moment of silence from the man, his eyes wavering but holding my gaze. Why are you doing this? The words were barely intelligible past his blubbering. Do you really need me to explain? I didn't do anything wrong! I am a pillar of this community! These people worship me! He cried. I was, quite frankly, flabbergasted. This man truly believed he was innocent? Mr. Mayor, does it make you feel better if I use your title? I literally just caught you in the other room. I pointed harshly, half undressed with an underage girl in even less clothing than you. That wasn't what it looked like. She came in while I was napping, and I woke up when you burst in. I shook my head in slow disappointment. Your lies have always gotten you out of trouble, haven't they? You've gotten away with brazen fraud, discrimination, and government corruption, all because you've convinced people to disbelieve the evidence of their own eyes and ears. You just deny, and never face a single consequence. By this point, I'd started pacing slowly around the man. Well, that's why I've been sent. I'm your consequence. For every lie you've told, for every time you've dressed yourself in holiness to hide your iniquity, for every man, woman, and especially child you have harmed, I have been sent. He'd started to shake. Whether it was from fear or blood loss, I couldn't say. Either way, time was running short. My 20 minutes were nearly up, assuming the girl had actually followed my instructions. You were almost certainly on your way here. Who are you to judge me? Tromler snarled. His flight and fawn had finally run out. He'd actually found some fight in his last moments. Everyone must face the final judge in the end, Mr. Tromler. He'll be handing you your sentence. I'm just moving the hearing up a little bit. I plucked my firearm from where I'd placed it on the desk. The suppressor was still attached, and I pointed it directly at Tromler. Please, he begged. Luke 17:2 was my only reply. What's that one? He asked. I pulled the trigger. The report cracked out, loud enough to hurt. His head slammed back into the wall with a cherry gore splatter, then slumped down to pour scarlet onto his bare chest. It would be better for you if a millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea than for you to cause one of these little ones to sin. I recited the verse to his carcass, mostly for the self-satisfaction. He'll be getting a crash course on divine wrath soon enough. From there, I sat down to finish writing what you're reading now. You might call it my confession, though I admit I have maintained my anonymity. After all, you're hardly bound by the seal of confession. I know there will be a great many questions about the mayor's death. I hope I have provided some answers here. He was a man engaged in great evil, such that divine intervention became necessary. I can hear the sirens now, so I will be leaving. I know you'll try to find me. You won't. Christ, he was just here, Warden spat to himself. He tore the relevant pages off of the legal pad and hurried out into the study. One of the unis had wandered their way inside. Hey, he called to her. She looked over at him with wide eyes. Yes, sir? We need to establish a perimeter in the neighborhood. The perp was just here. They can't have gotten far. Call it in and tell them to shut down the roads in a 10-mile area. She nodded to him and grabbed her radio, then paused as something occurred to her. Do we have a description of the perp? She asked. Warden shook his head. All I know is he's wearing purple and is likely riding a motorbike. He waved her off to make the calls, turning from her and running a palm over his bald pate. He eyed the pages in his hands and his gaze soured at the quagmire they put him in. Then he heard a familiar whistle and whipped his head around to look at the entryway. Myrtle Rogan had arrived, her badge sitting on her belt beneath a sharp umbral blazer. She was rubbernecking to stare at the dead man outside as she stepped into the house. Warden's heart skipped a beat, and he rushed to haphazardly fold and shove the pages into his interior jacket pocket. An instant later, she turned her head and met his gaze, her eyes wide. She pointed out the door with her thumb and put on an exaggerated grimace. How'd we pull this shit show? Her mass of curly black hair slithered around as she shook her head. Warden shrugged. Maybe because somebody doesn't know how to hold their tongue and insulted the literal director. Myrtle gave him a deadpan glare from beneath lowered brows. Flinders was being an asshole, and you know it. Doesn't mean you had to say something. Assholes aren't known for reacting well after being called out. Warden shrugged again. Shut the fuck up, Ben. She slashed her hand through the air and turned to look at the blood trail behind him. Tell me what we've got here. Hard to say for sure before forensics, but it looks to me like a pretty classic B&E. He didn't meet her gaze, pretending to re-examine the room as he explained. What? A burglar beat the shit out of 3 security professionals? Rogan's head was rattling back in her bewilderment. And what about that blood trail? Was a body moved? Warden looked over his shoulder, remembering the tattooed man described in the confessional pages in his pocket. Where was the body? We're literally here to investigate, Myrtle. I don't know exactly what happened. We're supposed to figure that out together. His orange eyebrows knit together. He was starting to feel pinned in. Any direction he could move in, holding shadow dangerous. All right, partner. No need to bite my head off. Myrtle sounded like she was trying to calm a suddenly rabid dog. I was just trying to see what you'd put together before I got here. Let's go examine the scene. Figure this out, like you said. He waved her towards the study. Main scene's in there. Go ahead and take a look. I'll be back in a few minutes and we can compare notes. She quirked an eyebrow. Where are you going? I just need to make a quick call. He illustrated the point by pulling his phone out from his pocket and waggling it in the air. She gave a shrug of her own and turned away to step towards the study. Warden stalked his way out through the door and past the body. He could see a few new forensics folk getting a couple of bags and gurneys ready to take the 2 corpses away. He tried to avoid thinking about the mountain of paperwork waiting for him and stalked out to the side of the yard to avoid any prying ears. He thrust his phone in front of his nose and started pulling up the dial pad on the touchscreen that was still far too small for his fingers. As he did, his peripheral caught sight of a motion, and he looked up to see the 2 men who'd been found unconscious outside the house. They were in the back of a squad car, writhing listlessly in their ongoing aches. Shit, Warden thought to himself. I'll have to ask what the boss wants me to do with those 2. They're loose ends. That girl we picked up at the gas station, too. Shaking his bald head at what he already knew he'd be asked to do, he started punching the number into his phone. Hey, thanks for listening. My name is Michael Galliano, and what you just heard was a fictional story both written and performed by me, Michael Galliano. If you made it this far, I hope that means you liked it. Make sure to drop a like and subscribe so you can be here for the next one. And if you really liked it, you can read all my future stories the moment they're finished before anyone else by joining my Patreon for just $1 a month.